Welcome to Fire Engineering Training Minutes. I'm Mike McEvoy. I'm going to talk about a drill today for self-application of a tourniquet. You can think about some situations where you may need to apply a tourniquet to yourself, and practicing that is probably a skill that we don't often consider. So 4 things we need to do this drill. We need a tennis ball, roller gauze, preferably 4-inch roller gauze, a pair of scissors to trim the gauze, and a training tourniquet. Today we're going to use the CAT tourniquet, which is a tourniquet that the military has specified as probably the most effective. I'll talk a little bit later about some potential alternatives to that are coming down the line. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the tennis ball and we're going to have our student hold the tennis ball, and then we're going to wrap the extremity in some cling. Wrapping the extremity in cling and using the tennis ball kind of renders that hand useless, which is what would happen if you had an injury where you actually had to self-apply a tourniquet. So now we're going to ask the student to take the tourniquet and apply the tourniquet using the other arm very quickly on himself. Difficult to do when you only have one hand. You can stand up. So you think about a situation like this and how quickly you're able to do that, and probably this requires some extra iterations until you can rapidly get a tourniquet on yourself. And you can create tension in the environment by yelling at people and telling them to move faster. A couple things I want to talk about with tourniquets. We can loosen this so that it's not cutting off your circulation. But the initial application of the tourniquet is where most tourniquet failures occur. So you saw he took the band when he was applying the tourniquet and pulled it really tightly on his arm. That's where most tourniquet applications fail, is not putting enough initial pressure on the tourniquet. You really should only need 1, maybe 2 turns of the windlass in order to get the tourniquet to adequately cut off blood flow. And now that we're talking about that, it may not necessarily work with every application. So in a military study of tourniquets, 82% of tourniquets applied actually were effective with the first tourniquet application. Second tourniquet applied above or below, if you have the room to apply it, will cut off the flow of blood and control the bleeding in 92% of incidences. A couple other things about tourniquets. You could sit down. Check your tourniquets in your bags. If you have tourniquets that are wrapped like this tourniquet is, that's not a useful tourniquet in an emergency. You just saw somebody try to apply a tourniquet with a single hand. If he had to unpackage this tourniquet and get it ready to use, the delay could cost his life. The faster a tourniquet is applied, the more effective it is. An initial application of a tourniquet has to happen very, very quickly. So look at your tourniquets and make sure that they're unwrapped from their packages and stored so that they're ready to use quickly. If you carry a tourniquet on yourself, make sure that tourniquet is unwrapped from its packaging, put in a fashion so that you could quickly apply it to yourself or to somebody else if you needed to do it. I mentioned that there are some changes in tourniquets, and one of the newest tourniquets that we're looking at currently and the military is studying comes to us from our friends that make the SAM splint. This tourniquet, to apply it, has a ratcheting system so that when you put it onto the extremity and you pull on the tourniquet, initially you'll hear a clicking noise. And that tourniquet locks in place in the position that it initially was applied, which alleviates some of the issue that happens with our earlier tourniquets where they loosen a little bit before you're actually able to tighten the windlass. 2 other things about tourniquets. Number 1, there definitely is a controversy about where to apply tourniquets. Our military folks talk about applying tourniquets high and tight on an extremity. Many of our trauma surgeons talk about applying tourniquets 2 to 3 inches above the wound on the extremity. No one has actually resolved the differences, but there are clearly reasons for it. In military application, oftentimes people are putting tourniquets on by themselves. High and tight makes it easier to apply a tourniquet, sliding it all the way up to the top of an arm or a leg. If you think about the rationale for tourniquets in a military environment, it oftentimes is from gunshot wounds. Often a bullet could travel along the trajectory of an extremity and cause tissue damage that's not visible at the entry site where the bleeding is occurring. Putting the tourniquet up high controls hemorrhage throughout the entire extremity. Tissue loss, though, from tourniquets concerns trauma surgeons, and oftentimes they'll suggest in local protocol that tourniquets be applied 2 to 3 inches above the site of a wound. That also allows you to put a second tourniquet in place relatively easily if it's necessary to do that. So you really need to look at your local protocols and follow what they say. Second thing about tourniquets, tourniquets hurt. Putting a tourniquet on somebody oftentimes, if not all the time, is going to require some analgesia. If you're working at the BLS level, you want to consider getting somebody to come to provide some pain medication for a patient who has a tourniquet applied. The military hands out packets that soldiers can take that provide analgesia when they're injured or have a tourniquet applied to them. Certainly something that we have to think about in the civilian use of tourniquets. So that's a drill that you could do in your training center on self-application of a tourniquet to a firefighter, not a situation that necessarily all of us are prepared to do, something that we really need to train on. So for Fire Engineering Training Minutes, I'm Mike McEvoy. Be smart out there.